So if you've been on this channel before, you know I love discussing and theorizing about the lore of the series and the political and social dynamics of Gintama. And a thought I've had since first watching Gintama is what exactly happened to the rest of the world in Gintama and how other nations could have been subjugated. We only ever learn or know about Japan's interaction with the Yamato and Tendosho, and the rest of the world is only ever mentioned in passing or for gags. While I know that the reason for this is mostly because Gintama is supposed to parallel Japan's interactions with the West in the mid to late 1800s, so the rest of the world isn't really supposed to be included. But I can't help but imagine and theorize as to how the rest of the world would deal with an invasion of a power such as the Tendosho. I know that this is a comedy manga and that it's not meant to be taken too seriously in this regard, and that I'm overthinking this way too much, but this aspect of any series lore fascinates me greatly. I have the same questions about the Fallout series, 1984, Handmaid's Tale, Last of Us, and any other work of alternate history or dystopian fiction that's so focused on one specific area. I always end up asking the question, what happened to the rest of the world? How did other places transform? How did they react? What's remained the same? And Gintama is no exception. We're presented with a life-changing force large enough to destroy our entire planet, but we only ever get concrete answers as to how one place was affected. So excuse me as I try to make sense of something that I'm not supposed to be making sense of. Anyway, just a little disclaimer before I start, I'm not a historian of any kind, and while I enjoy learning and reading about history, there's a lot I don't know, so I'm bound to make quite a few mistakes in this video. So if I say something that isn't entirely accurate or straight up wrong, please don't destroy me. Feel free to point it out, I'll appreciate if you do. But just don't annihilate me. I'm not claiming to be an expert on any of this. I'm just discussing an interesting subject, and if you feel like you have a possible sequence of events that makes more sense, go ahead and let me know in the comments. I would love to get this discussion going. Now, lining things up with the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853, we can assess the strength of the rest of the world when the Yamato arrive, if the Yamato are supposed to be stand-ins for the Western powers that the US opened the floodgates to. So today we'll start with the United States. So in this alternate timeline, the Tendosho beat Commodore Perry to Japan and started a similar series of events to the real-life Japan at this time. But that begs the question, what became of the United States in this timeline? Assuming they have the same military strength and culture as in our timeline, now the US was able to bully Japan, but 1850s USA was a time of extreme fragmentation, with the Civil War on the horizon and tensions with Mexico and Native American tribes. I can imagine the Yamato would take advantage of that to subjugate the United States, with factions even trying to take advantage of the Yamato for their own gain. Trying to assess what we know, the US had a standing army of about 7,000 in 1845, according to the US Center of Military History. But despite the divisions, pre-Civil War United States was a rich nation and could easily fund a larger army for more expansive military operations, as they did with Mexico in the 1840s. And due to their seizure of California and Texas in this time period, the United States would have access to a lot more resources come the Tendosho's arrival. In the 1850s, the US was in constant conflict with many Native American tribes, and my theory is that the Yamato would take advantage of this to further destabilize the US. That said, I don't think they would be able to convince every Native American tribe to take their side. Native American tribes were very diverse in their cultures, relations with white settlers, political alignments, and economic situations, as well as motives. But the Tendosho arming certain Native American factions could have sped up the process. However, I'm almost sure in the end that the Yamato would not treat Native Americans any better, and any alliances forged would only be a means to an end and nothing more. One factor favoring the US in this situation, though, is their massive geographical size. The US is a lot of ground to cover for the Tendosho, and as said before, the US has access to resources and manpower to sustain a resistance for a long time because of that geographical size. But an equalizing factor for the Tendosho could be the divisions in and around the United States. The Tendosho could have played Mexico, the US, the Native American tribes, and the US South and North off of each other to dismantle the US and its neighbors quicker. The next major issue for the US would be the technological gap militarily. There was literally no such thing as military aircraft during this time, and any naval power would be immediately crippled by the Tendosho's insane air power. On the ground, troops and militias would fare better with access to firearms, unlike Japan during this time period, which had little firearms, with the ones they have being vastly outdated. But we know that in Japan, many guerrilla tactics with only swords were successful, so armed soldiers and militia would probably do even better, but it would only prolong the inevitable. Even on the ground, the Yamato have a vastly superior advantage. We've seen the kind of destructive melee weapons they're capable of making, such as Bato and Obe Hajame's swords, which can probably dismantle entire units, as well as laser projectile weapons of all kinds, which far outclass any rifles at the time, and the only possible weapon that might have gave the United States a slight chance was the Gatling gun, but that was not invented until the 1860s, and I think by that time, it'd be far too little, far too late, for any difference to be made on the ground. And of course, the Yamato will have soldiers with insane raw strength, such as your Shokakus and your Hosens, so the US's advantage would ultimately be pointless. So you might be thinking, if humans like Katsura and Gintoki can take on guys as big as Shokaku and Hosen, why can't American soldiers do it? And one bullshit headcanon reason I have for that is that Gintoki and Katsura might have been affected by the Altana, which could have strengthened them significantly, since Japan in Gintama has the largest amount of Altana reserves. It's mostly just my own headcanon, and I have no idea how valid that is. Anyway, one thing that's generally overlooked about the effects of the American Civil War is how its end created a whole new patriotic culture around being American that boosted its industrialization and expansion. Pre-Civil War United States, while strong with a lot of money, was still somewhat fragmented among state lines. Hell, Ohio and Michigan almost went to war in 1836, and tensions over states holding slaves and the animosity over the subject of abolitionism is what started the whole Civil War in the first place. With the Yamato taking advantage of the United States' many fragmentations, I think their conquest of the USA would be significantly easier than we actually would think. I just don't think the US would be prepared to handle an invasion of such a scale in their condition at that time, with all the issues they were dealing with. If it was just maybe one major conflict with two sides, maybe they could unite. But 1850s USA had 4 major issues to deal with at this time. Tensions between the North and South, tensions with Mexico, tensions with Native American tribes, and state divisions. It would just be too much on the US to be invaded by an army as powerful as the Tendosho at the time. Moving on to the future, this shot of Sogo in New York suggests that in 20 years, the United States did experience the same rapid technological advancement as Edo, looking a lot like present-day New York. However, much like Edo Japan, I believe many elements of 1850s to 70s culture and architecture probably remain. So despite the modernistic look, I assume there are still many people with suits, top hats, and long dresses. I can assume that the US is still a rather conservative place, and judging by how the Tendosho allowed Japan to keep most of its cultural elements intact, I assume that the racial inequalities of the time would still be very prevalent in this version of the United States. Now, the US in the 1850s was a democracy, and it would probably stay that way under the Tendosho. But in regards to the political parties, I think the Tendosho would disband or destroy any parties that aren't favorable to them, therefore having elections be controlled, with only candidates that fit their agenda ever making it to the campaigning stage. A regular democratic platform would allow for a candidate that doesn't share the Tendosho's interests to rise to power, which could be problematic for them. So I assume every 4 years the Tendosho would have to enforce their authority over the political parties and elections, and the subsequent list of US presidents would be vastly different. Now, I feel like the reason the Tendosho allowed Japan to maintain its cultural and societal structure was to better keep control over the nation. If they uprooted the entire country's culture and norms, they would have had an even more difficult time controlling an angry population. So aside from controlling the elections, I feel like the Tendosho wouldn't disrupt the political and bureaucratic functions of the time, and most forms of institutionalized and societal racism would remain to appease the country's financially and culturally dominant white classes. So I don't see the Tendosho making American society better or more advantageous for minorities or poor people in general. This is only because the Tendosho understands how to keep a country in line, and that isn't by dismantling everything that nation knows. Regardless, whether you agree with their culture or not, one of the most ugly side effects I can imagine of the Tendosho using this policy is that they would likely stop efforts to abolish slavery dead in their tracks, since it was the apparent threat of losing their slaves that caused the South to go into rebellion in our timeline. So my theory is that the current USA of the Gintama world is still very much a divided place, with the Tendosho only adding another layer of division with their presence. When the Tendosho are inevitably thrown out of Earth, the US would maintain most of its social and political issues, but parties would have more advanced weapons at their disposal, and the resulting conflicts could even be more deadly than in our timeline. So anyway, that's my theory on what happened to the US in Gintama, and what shape it could be in now. If this video is received well, I would love to discuss theories on how other major powers and regions may have reacted. Once again, I hope nobody took this too seriously, and if I've said anything inaccurate or offensive, I do apologize. I want to discuss this subject in a manner that doesn't offend or alienate anyone, and if I did, it wasn't intentional. Thank you so much for watching, thank you for all the support, and take care.